let me warn you, I'm going to be saying some things here today which are going to conflict with some of the things you've learned in the past. And it's not that the approach I'm going to suggest to you is right, but I'm doing it because what I want to do is give you a choice to make, so you can make choices when you're deciding how to present things. Because what I'm going to be doing is talking about presenting. So that's what it is. And why is presenting important? It's important because you're in the transportation business. You're going to be asking people for investment in infrastructure, maybe, yes? You might do, yeah. Or investment in truck safety, or investment in truck parking, or whatever. You're going to be asking for things. And if you're engineers who've got really good ideas, it's going to stretch the audience's understanding of things, because good ideas should be slightly ahead of where people are, because if they're not slightly ahead of where people are, they don't need you. So they need your good ideas, but you've got to communicate them to them in a persuasive way. So what I'm going to be talking about is how do you persuade people? I want you to think. Now think about, let's just take a moment, think about an important decision you needed, an important ask you had in your life, where you asked for something. Think about it. How did you approach it? What did you do? So, anybody here's married? Who's married here? Anybody married? Okay, so there we are. So how did you propose?
Yeah.
You did. Did you use a PowerPoint presentation? No. What sort of engineer is this? Did she say yes?
Yes.
You didn't use a PowerPoint presentation and she said yes. Isn't that amazing? So, what did we learn? What did we learn from this? That when we're actually trying to get big decisions, we didn't use a PowerPoint presentation, and we've got to think, why didn't we? And we didn't do that because decisions involve emotion. She adored him, right? She had emotional commitment. And logic. Oh, I gotta go home and tell Dad I'm marrying an engineer. Yeah, now what's the logic? Oh, Dad, it's gonna be all right because, yeah, that's, so emotion and logic, and we're gonna talk about how you take those two thoughts, and incorporate them into what you're doing when you're presenting your project, your great ideas, etc., to persuade the people who write the checks, Dad, to put the money into your projects. That's what we're going to do this morning. And it's going to involve you in a little bit of participation, so get ready. Oh, no. I've got to get ready here. So the challenge is that most decisions are made by groups, and they're briefed by people like you, experts. You know, it's a pity we're not sitting around the table, because that's if we were doing, you know, madam, can you come sit over here? We're very cozy, and you know, this is about how groups work and presentations, and I've already asked the question about how you propose to your partner, and so you don't have to worry about that. So, good. So decisions are made by groups, and they're the groups that are presented to by people like you with good ideas. So this is it. You've got most decisions made by groups, briefed by experts like you in presentations. When you're making these presentations, you've got to win their support. You've got to imagine them sitting around the table, and after you've gone, they said, well, we've heard what Caesar said here. Who supports it? How do you get people to put their hands up and say, I support it? So you've got to think, how do you win the support? So when we're doing this, we've got to win the support from decision makers, and to do this is the crucial thing. This is the one thing. If you do nothing else, I'm going to convince you to remember after this morning. You do this by connecting with each decision maker, and you do this through communication. sorry. But he didn't use a PowerPoint presentation. He probably was sitting across the dinner table and he was looking. You know, we can imagine it. We've all watched the rom-coms, and so we know how this happens. So it's communication. So what we're going to do, first of all, is think about how we communicate. And the point about communication is to understand that communication involves the situations when you're presenting decision-making groups, and the communication is you. It's you. The reason we don't use PowerPoint presentations when we're making proposals of marriage is because, you know, it's hard to fall in love with a PowerPoint presentation. It's you are the presentation. So this is it. So how do we go about this when we're dealing with groups? Communication is sending a message. You can't see this, but there's a lovely smile here. Sending a presentation and seeing that the message has been delivered and been received. So communication is sending and receiving. Sending and receiving. Now, you say, oh, well, this is difficult when you've got a whole group, and how do you do it? But we're going to talk about how you do it. But you've got sending and receiving, because you're really persuading people step by step to reach the emotional side of their brain. And if they're engaged with the emotional side of the brain, then perhaps they will then begin to think through the logic of things. If you don't engage them emotionally, they don't get to the logic part. And the tendency for people is to broadcast. You know, the cross down is one of the best things that's ever been seen, and etc. And they broadcast to the audience instead of coming back and saying, we should do the Eglinton cross down. It's going to really help the people at Eglinton and Young. It's going to stop children getting killed on the crossings. It's very personal and it's individual. It's one thing at a time. And that's what you've got to do. So you've got to look into everybody's eyes. You can't communicate persuasively unless you look into their eyes and get a response. Am I getting a response? I'm getting a response. So, okay. So when you're dealing with several people say, well, how do you deal with, so this group is probably typical of what you'd have when you've got a decision-making group about this size or a bit smaller. How do you deal with it when it's a bigger group? And when it's a bigger group, you use the same technique. You look at each person one at a time, and you get the response, and the rest of the room is watching what happens. And when you move on to here, they're still watching, and they're still watching. And so you don't lose a room of 100 people just because you communicate like that. You actually bring them with you. Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, professor at Harvard, was in an event with her where she had 100 people all day. And I thought, she's never going to be able to keep these people engaged for a whole day by herself. She did. She did it one at a time, going around the room for 6 hours. And it was an amazing performance. And persuading people that what she was telling them to do is the right thing. So you address them one at a time, and you take a separate idea to each person. And you keep their attention, but being energetic. That's why I move around. Because the presentation is you. You know, one of the things you tend to have is people standing well away from us. So when you think about it, who uses presentations, uses laser pointer in presentations? Anyone use laser pointer in presentations? Yeah, so only one bad. Well, that's not bad. A lot of people use laser pointers. Can anybody think why, when you're doing persuasive presentations, you shouldn't use the laser pointer? Why would you use the laser pointer when you're doing presentations? Guess.
Because the audience want to pay attention to what I say, they have to watch it without any pointer. Find the thing that I'm here to say without any pointer.
Well, that's right. But it's also because you want them to look at you But you also want them, so what you do is you point to the screen. So you can see how this point here, you're looking into each person's eyes, you see that's important. But you can look at me and you can look at that. I want you to look at that. A good example of that is go watch Al Gore's presentation on an inconvenient truth. And he was trained by one of the best presenters in the business, best trainers in the business on presentations. And you see at one stage in here, he goes on a cherry picker because the screen is too high. So one of the questions that you say, well, what do I do if the screen is too high? Don't I need a point? You can just point. Always use numbers and point, because you want to keep bringing it back to you. When you see presentations occurring in a university setting, it's about education. It's not about persuasion, it's about education. So the professor doesn't have to look at your eyes. In fact, I had a professor who spent all his time just writing in the days of the blackboard, writing on the blackboard, never looked at the students at all. But that's a different type of presentation. This is persuasive presentations, where you are asking for a big commitment, where you're asking for money, you're asking for people to put their jobs on the line, which is what you're doing when you're asking organizations to approve things. You're asking for things, and that's what's different, and that's why you've got to point with your finger and look in their eyes rather than use a laser pointer. So, once you've established communication, you've got to decide how you're going to influence them. So one of the things you've got to do, you've got to have an easy to understand structure. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about structure, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about logic, and I'm going to give you some information about levers of influence. Levers of influence. And what I think I should acknowledge right at this stage, we're going to do this in a few minutes, is you could do a week-long course on how to do persuasive presentations. I'm just giving you the beginning and the structure, and I urge you to go and research it better. So, you give the audience an understanding structure. I'm going to take you through this. So, you've got to customize your approach to the audience. I'll tell you a bit about that. And then you've got to decide about the levers of influence. You sometimes use slides for emphasis, but you've got to bring the attention back to yourself. So let me just stop there. Questions? Questions so far, what I've said so far? Who thinks it's going to be difficult to do? Everybody. Now why do we think it's difficult? We're not used to standing up and putting ourselves out there, right? And everything you learn about doing presentations is, imagine the audience, imagine the audience haven't got any clothes on, right? Then you'll think they're funny and you've got to be with the audience, you've got to empathize with them, you've got to reach into their psyche, because you have got to persuade them, this is, and you might think it's not as big a question as asking someone to marry you, but you're asking people to support a major project which may cost them their job, may cost them the election, all sorts of things. So, anyway, questions? Now, if you ever ask for questions in a group, you never go on until you've got one, because that means you didn't really want any questions. So, questions? Or should we go for coffee right now?
I may have a question.
Good.
Yeah, I noticed that, so you asked for a question after 20 minutes of speech. So
Yeah.
how do you handle the individuals of the...
How often? Probably I went on too long. I think you need questions earlier than that. And you want questions because you want engagement. So, I told you about Rosabeth Moscanto. Big room, she walked around and said, I just talked about decision making is emotional and logical. What do you think about that? And the first time she does it, and you realise every time she asked for a question, it could be you, the next one. So you paid attention for 6 hours, a whole day. Yeah, and these were senior executives. I mean, hard to keep them off their phones, right? Is it because, but we've got a question, so is there another question though? I mean, seriously, it's not just about engagement, it's about learning and taking these things on board. Jude, do you have a question?
No, I'm just listening, but I have a question. I'm listening. Well, what do you have to know about your audience before you start?
Okay, we'll come to that. Good. All right. So, and the question is why you don't use laser. We've done with that. So, did you read ahead? I think you techie types, you're good at this. So you've got to tailor the structure and content to your audience. So different types of audience think about things and deal with things in different ways. And let me give you an example. I was having to decide whether or not a company should invest in buying a big recreation forum in Montreal, or whether they should invest the money in Toronto. I did a brilliant report, 75-page report. It was so good. I took it along, presented to the CEO, and he says, good, yeah, I like the recommendation. Now, I need this on 3 slides. 75-page report, 3 slides. So I went away and I came back with 12 slides. He said, no, this is not good enough. Here's my assistant, you work with them. And this assistant, myself, worked on turning these 12 slides into 3 slides. And I said to him, Mickey, I said, why is that? He said, we're dealing with the board of a major corporation. This is a board meeting, it'll run for 3 hours, they've got all these decisions to make, and how long do you think they can spend on this? You know, this is a big investment, but they can spend 15 minutes. So they need it all, to see it all in 15 minutes. That's why it's got to be on 3 sides. So one thing is to know what sort of audience you're dealing with. So with senior people, you put the recommendation first. You start with it, and because they want to know how much of their intellect to devote to the issue that they're looking at the time. Because they're not going to deal with just one thing, as a group, they're going to deal with a number of things along the way. So senior groups of executives, you tend to put the recommendation first, and you might have a bit of logic afterwards, but you stop very quickly and say, any questions, and you let them take you to the issues that they're concerned about. So senior people, you do that. With more technical people, engineers like yourselves, you tend to you present the problem, and then what you have to do is get the agreement on what the problem is. Do we agree that parking is a problem in downtown Toronto? Yes, no. Do we agree? Do we think it's so important that we need to spend money on it? You've got to get agreement about the problem, then you take them through the analysis, then you take them to the recommendation. So that the one variation on that we're thinking about is with politicians. Politicians often don't want to be committed in the room at the time. So you might give them some options and leave it a little bit open at the time. Again, I'm generalizing. Different audiences, you need different things that you're going to do. But this is a general rough model. So senior people, recommendations first. More technical people, you deal with the problem analysis and recommendation. The problem often with the engineers I work with is they start back at the history. You know, they're back in Adam and Eve in the garden. You know, this is where it all started. It takes ages to get to. When are we going to get there? You know, so that's the way you do it. You also got to decide what their role is in this decision-making process. And so, what might be the problems, Caesar, if you have it when you're dealing with a group and you're not sure what their role is? What sort of issue might be on your mind when you're trying to get a decision?
Well, maybe doing some kind of discussion with the group.
That's something you might do, but what might be the problem that you would see in the group that when you're asking for them a decision from them. What might be the problem you're running into?
Maybe they don't know what the variables that are in the problem to make the right decision correctly.
So they might not feel they know enough.
Yeah.
Good. They also might feel they've not got enough authority. So you've got to understand what their role is in decision making, because one of the ways to make a persuasive presentation is you've got to ask for something. And you've got to ask for something that's reasonable. And the least you can ask for is another meeting where you give them the opportunity to come back and present again with the additional information that they might need, something like that. So you've got to decide their role, you've got to decide what they know already, because you don't want to bore them, and I'm probably boring you because you knew this already, and you've got to decide which influences, levers of influence you will use, and they usually have two components, facts and figures linked to logic, that's the one side of the brain, and then you've got to have the emotional side of the brain, which is successful case studies, and that's particularly useful with politicians and senior people. I was asked to look at whether Toronto should have an economic development authority covering the whole of the GTA, and I put together a presentation and etc. And I started to make it, and the first thing I said was, you know, there are 50 organizations in North America that have regional economic development authorities, and I can't see why Toronto doesn't have one. One of the politicians stood up and said, I agree, I think we should have one. Someone else said, I seconded it, there was a vote. I never made my presentation, it was all over before I started, because the example was so powerful. I mean, the other people did it, we didn't, that it worked. So, we've got a laser pointer, we've got that one down. Okay. So I think we've dealt. So in structuring, you generally use when you get slides, make sure they don't jump around. It's distracting. The recommendation should be linked to the problem. So start with the recommendation, but link it back to the problem. Present options because you want to discard options. That say, look, we might do something about parking, but we don't want to do too much because we don't want to encourage people not to ride the transit. We might do that. So you look at the options and you discard them, put them aside. It's a sort of preemptive dismissal of the objections, and then you go for a closing. You ask for a decision at the end, and that's very important. If you don't ask for it, then you won't get it. And being orientated toward getting a decision is very important because it gives you focus, it gives you energy, it gives you a mission. I mean, otherwise, why are you there? If you're not there to persuade them, if you're there just because your boss said go along and make a presentation, you're worth more than that. You didn't go and study at University of Toronto just to go and do presentations like that. You came here to make yourself better at doing what you do, so you could make things change. Safer parking, safer trucks, and that sort of thing. So let's think then about what changes people's minds, besides the general sort of thing of emotion and logic. So this is the book you've got to read, The Principles of Influence by Robert Cialdini. Read this book. This is, everybody should read this book. It talks about how people are influenced and how they change their minds, and how you can influence them. And it's useful to think about that, because that's what you're in the business of. What's the point of you doing all your multimodal analysis if at the end of it you reach a conclusion and you can't persuade anybody that it works? So first of all, commitment and consistency. Anybody got any ideas on how that might work? over in the back there, how do you think commitment and consistency might be improved? What do you think might be under that heading that would you could use commitment and consistency to get a positive decision on something?
I think you need to show that you're at the equal footing as your audience.
No, that wasn't quite what I was after. Well, I wouldn't take another crack at it.
You show that you really care about something.
Yeah, this is words. I probably didn't put the question very well. This is how you change people's minds. So, okay, sorry, come back to the wedding analogy again, marriage analogy again. So, this is the commitment and consistency. Will you marry me? Yes. Here's the ring, engagement ring. Yes. Let's set a date. What are the issues? The fiancé changes his or her mind. What do people say in that circumstance? I know you've ever had that, but what do you imagine they might say? I mean, who's watching the Hallmark channel? What do they say on the Hallmark channel about when people change their mind after they promise to marry someone? What do they do? What do they say? What's the first thing they say? And what? Get lost?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, that's good.
It's not you, it's me.
That's George and Seinfeld.
Yeah.
I'm not here prepared.
What they say, but you said yes.
Uh-huh.
But you said yes. You previously committed. So you say to decision makers, well, you agreed there was a problem, and you committed that if there was this sort of problem, it was this big, and etc. And you said you'd do it. Last year, you said you'd do it. So commitment. You had it in the party manifesto in the election. So previous commitments. You go to those. If you do any sort of legal work in hearings, lawyers will go back and see all the things you said in reports previously, and they'll feed it back to you on the stand and try and catch you out. So commitment and consistency is one way. So you say to people, you said you were going to do it, now's the time to do it. And people find that quite persuasive. The group or precedent was the one that needs other people are doing it, or you've done it before, is another way to do it. Authority is another way people's mind gets changed. And that is when it's seen as the expert comes, who knows more than everybody else about some say scientific issue. Who can think of the expert that we've been dealing with on COVID, who everybody listens to? Dr. Fauci. My goodness. I mean, I didn't know his name 2 years ago. Now it's Dr. Fauci, the authority.
Whatever the name of the Tory one is.
I'm not quite sure, no.
Yeah.
I listen to Dr. Fauci. Anyway, he's the authority. But you can see how authority works. And it's very powerful, and it gets challenged. But that's one way you get people to change their minds. Dr. Fauci says social proof. I gave you the example of the economic development issue, and others are doing it. Why can't you do it? And others are doing it, succeeds. And social proof changes people's minds. Scarcity. Anyone ever bought a used car? You bought a used car? Yeah. So what does the salesman say to you? Or the saleswoman say to you?
It's gonna out of stock.
Pardon?
Out of stock very soon.
That's right. It's going on scarcity. You better sign now, because you come back tomorrow, it'll be gone.
Yeah.
That's it. So there we are. So scarcity. You've got to. The other thing is liking. People will do things because they like the communicative decision making. This is not quite as powerful, but often. And reciprocity. Reciprocity, if you do this, I'll do this. So it's transactional, so reciprocity. These things all influence people and are levers that change their mind. Sometimes a group of them come together, some it's just one at a time. And there's a whole book written about this. Any questions about those levers? Anybody think of where it doesn't really work? Yes.
Yeah, just, I was wondering if you have a preferred, like which one we should try first, like which one is stronger, or it depends on the context.
I think it depends on the context. Your skill is looking at this thing and say, you know, I think what's going to work with this. The way I like to think about it is, you know, with tumbler locks, you have to get the cylinders all lined up to turn the lock. You cut through a tumbler lock. I look at a group of people who are decision making and say, okay, what's going to make each of these people, you know, and I can turn the lock and get a decision. I sold $1 million worth of work to a major Canadian corporation by saying, we're going to have the cabinet meeting, the cabinet sitting around the table, and we want them to vote for your project. Now we've got to think about how we get each of these cabinet ministers to put up their hand in support of it, and how we're going to motivate them, how we're going to think about that. Right? So I like that. I always have this tumbler lock model in my mind when I'm thinking about that. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, Judy.
So especially talking to a bunch of engineers, what do you do if you want to be persuasive with facts? And then maybe sometimes the facts aren't persuasive.
Well, I think you say if the facts aren't persuasive. Okay, well, I'll come to that in a minute. So but you can't get them to listen to the facts until you fully engage them through this process of communication. And so that's the point. Other question. I mean, come on, there must be some things you might say, oh, this doesn't really work.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the first point about commitment and consistency. What
Right.
if, like, I do a presentation and the people in front of me get, like, persuaded by what I said, and then a year later into the project, they change their minds. What should I do?
True. Well, first of all, when you go back, you say, well, a year ago was this, what has changed? You know, and I'm going to explore that with you just in a minute. So, you like questions because this is, it means people are listening, and it's an opportunity to connect further. You know, I feel we've connected more because of your questions. Yeah, I mean, so if I was in a group meeting and you'd ask questions, you know, I'd come back to you on things because that's the way you work the group. So, opportunity to connect, opportunity to emphasize important. What you see with engineers going presenting on these projects, they don't like questions. They say, hold the questions till the end. No. Why mustn't you hold the questions to the end? Why shouldn't you ask them to hold the questions to the end? Yes?
People forget.
People forget?
They might lose interest in the rest of the presentation because they might get stuck on that.
That's right. And they're frustrated.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Hold it to the end. Oh, no, hold it to the end. I don't care enough about you to answer your problem. You know, so, you know, shall we get married? Well, let's finish dinner first. I mean, you know, anyway, so you've got to emphasize and embrace the question that your question is. Explain simply. Then after you've dealt with the question, does that satisfy you? Then you can answer it. And then, if you can't do it all, then you think ahead, say, well, we'll provide it another time. People will ask questions at meetings where it's got to be dealt with at another time. I ran a whole consultation program across the province of Ontario, and in these public meetings, people were asking questions that had nothing to do with what we're talking about, the Environmental Act. And you know, I had to say, right, look, let me get your name and everything, and we'll get back to you on the immigration question or whatever it was that they were concerned about. But it wasn't to do with environmental regulations. So how do you deal with objections? So, oh, stop. You know, no one's done this. Well, the gentleman over there almost did. Stop. You know, I mean, this presentation is not what we want at all. This is not what we want. And then what you do, you're asking for, well, what do you want? So I want approval, you know, I want you to have adopted all this. Have you bought into this? You know, have you bought into this? Or did you find what I've told you persuasive? No, there's lots of things you've overlooked here, Mr. Farrow, so, okay. Then what is it that you didn't find convincing? Well, I didn't find this convincing. Okay, well, I think if you did this and did this and this, so you find out about the question, you answer it, and then you test, well, now I've answered that question, do you support the project? Well, yes, but I'm still concerned about this. You keep going through a process of asking for a decision, answering the objection, and then you move on to the next one, and you move on to the next one. And hopefully, at the end of it, and it might not be in the one meeting, you get to commitment, you get, I don't know, the Eccleton Crosstown approved. That's how you do it. The process of testing, handling objection, testing, with the idea of narrowing it down. It's got to be dynamic. You probably can't wait for a year, because things change too much, but that's how you work through the objections. And in summary, we got through this though. The most important thing is you being the primary communication hero. You're not going to persuade anybody to marry you using a PowerPoint presentation and a laser. Okay for education, good, but the trouble is when we get to this stage of our careers, most of what we've seen is educational presentations, not persuasive presentations, and they're different. And you're going into a world which is cut and thrust, and you've got to get your ideas in front of people and get them to support it. Always have a purpose. A purpose gives you energy and it gives you power. And in some senses, I think it makes you less nervous. You know, because this is important. Caesar here, he's a warrior. With a name like Caesar's got to be a warrior. So he's out there fighting for his ideas. So and he gives you courage. And so, don't all have to change your name to Caesar to be courageous, but you can all be courageous. So be clear about your purpose. Be clear about what the audience can do, because if they may have limited abilities to decide, and it's above their pay grade, they haven't got the money, etc. But you ask them, say, okay, if you haven't got the money, will you support me when I go and see the federal government and ask for the money then? You've got to be organised so you can take it through a logic, and you've got to determine whether to use visual aids. Some of the best presenters I've seen, the most persuasive, because I used to run a lot of lectures, some really good people, I'd say, well, what about PowerPoint? So, I don't need anything, thank you, don't need anything, I'll just do it. And they were, because they kept the attention focused on themselves, and they were very persuasive, and they didn't go on as long as I've gone on this morning. So we determined, because I think visual aids are useful up to a point, but don't rely on them. And again, you want to look at how to use visual aids cleverly. I told you about Al Gore. Hans Rosling. Does anybody know the name Hans Rosling? Is that the name? He is a Swedish health economist. And look him up. He's done some of the best the best presentation I've ever seen. He had projected up sort of a transparent screen, and he worked behind the screen using the graphics on the screen, which he moved with his fingers. I mean, just very engaged and very, very powerful. And thank you very much. Oh, I've included this because I think you can print out copies as an appendix. I didn't want to talk to it, but it's a way of, when you've got to do a presentation, you can use this as a structure. It gives you some guidance to get going, dividing into 3 parts, starting with a beginning and a conclusion. But I don't want to talk about it, I just included it for information.